Thank you very much. It's really a great opportunity to address the distinguished audience, and I would like to share with you some thoughts on the war, on the war itself, on the situation in Ukraine, and of course on its implications, both on Ukraine, on Russia, and on the region and the international relations as a whole. So I would try to keep it, not very long, and to give you some kind of Ukraine focus, of course, Ukraine perception of the situation. First of all, I would like to start that from some conclusions which we might be able to make today. Of course, not all conclusions. It's really very difficult to jump to any conclusions today with regard to especially the consequences of especially with how the situation will end, because it's really very tense still today, and it's dynamic. It's really changing on a daily basis. But I would like to start with how the war was transformed in the last month, in the last 30 days, from Ukraine perspective. So how I see it, I would divide this into three phases, which we saw during the last 30 days. The first phase is the first week, when Russian forces were trying to surround and block main Ukrainian cities, avoiding storming them, while using numerous, mainly paratroopers, to land them near Kyiv and to capture the capital. Ultimately, it seemed that these tactics failed to produce quick and meaningful results, and major Russian land parties, which we saw across the border at the beginning of the war, they were unable to break into the major big cities where they concentrated. And this led us to the second phase, which covered the second, third, and fourth weeks, when the war it switched to a position war, where shelling was very often, when Russians started shelling big cities, hitting not only military infrastructure, as it was at the very beginning, but also civilian one, including critical infrastructure like thermal plants, power plants, railroad junctions, warehouses. So everything that provided basic utilities for people. And this was the moment when it had a devastating effect on humanitarian situation in Ukraine, when it became one of the fast growing, growing very fast. For example, if we take the city of Chernihiv in northeastern Ukraine, it was partially surrounded from day one, and from 285,000 people who resided there, more than half fled during these second, third, and fourth weeks. So it was a huge humanitarian crisis for Ukraine. And however, we saw that Russians weren't able to capture the cities, so the war switched to a more prolonged one, and this led us to the third phase, in which I believe we are still today. It's the last week, which we saw when Russians apparently refocused their military attention on the offensive in the east and south of Ukraine, where they were able to occupy some territories. This was also combined with their political demands, scaled back a little, so they changed over time. Because, for example, after yesterday's Istanbul peace talks, we saw comments from both Russian and Ukrainian delegations, and they were absolutely different from what we heard at the beginning of the war, because Russians, well, at least what they told is they agreed to withdraw from territories occupied after 24th of February. There were no demands yesterday related to the so-called demilitarization and denazification, the two things that were voiced at the very beginning of the war by Russian president, including by the Russian president, and which were initially at the very heart of Russia's invasion. And when Russian president gave his speech on 23rd of February, announcing the beginning of the invasion, these two demands, the demilitarization and the so-called denazification, were very important. Now we see that the Russian demands and actually the political agenda on the talks have become modest. Now I would go to the implications of the situation that we had for more than 30 days. I would divide it into two dimensions mainly. So generally, the first dimension is the economic dimension. Russia's invasion to Ukraine effectively launched massive processes related to swift changes in the economic and trade balance in the region and in the world, especially long term. First of all, in my opinion, it allowed for a strategic redistribution of energy markets, especially in Europe, in favor of other players, including the United States, Turkey, Qatar, probably Algeria, Egypt, and other countries in terms of gas. Although I consider it quite difficult, a full stop, of all Russian gas exports into Europe, but I think a substantial amount of it, as a result of invasion, is likely to be reduced in the coming years, with other countries taking more prominent role in gas exports to Europe. The European Union has already adopted the relevant strategy till 2030. And so they are not able to refuse gas imports from Russia right now, because it's over 40% of their gas imports are coming from Russia. But of course, it is obvious now that this will be one of medium to long-term implications of Russian invasion, that its gas exports to Europe will be reduced. For Ukraine, in this context, Russian invasion actually accelerated the process of Ukraine switching off from Russia's energy grid system, to which we were connected for many years, and integrating it into the European energy network, which was completed just 2 weeks ago. So this is one of very key implications for Ukraine as a result of the invasion. Secondly, Russian invasion changed the oil market as well. Although no immediate fundamental changes occurred after invasion, of course, except a surge of oil prices, which we saw, and which led to, of course, prices rising in oil-dependent countries for gasoline. And but it is clear now that the invasion prompted other countries to begin finding ways to push Russia out of oil exports to Europe. Now, this is particularly true about the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, those countries who already made the decision to put the so-called embargo on oil imports from Russia, although they didn't import much, but still they made this political decision. To some extent, we can say that because of Russian invasion of Ukraine, US-Iran nuclear talks also were revived after they almost deadlocked in January, which is also a very important implication, regional and international dimension. In this context, the main challenge for Ukraine also is finding a substitute for Russian and Belarusian oil products, which we imported for quite a long time. So the invasion also created a significant challenge for us as well. And now with Russian military ships, for example, blocking the Black Sea ports in Ukraine, the European land routes are effectively the only ones for importing fuel and gasoline to Ukraine. So the situation, and also the situation worsens because Russia, in this phase 3 of the war in which we are now, during the last week, for example, Russia is focused on hitting precisely fuel depots and oil bases in different regions in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine as well. During the last week, several of them were hit, unfortunately. Another also implication I would like to talk about is that I think it's also it actually relates to international system as a whole. The unprecedented informal boycott by foreign companies who left Russian market, preceded by Western-led economic sanctions and financial restrictions, once again raised the issues of sanctions instruments as coercive means in modern international relations, which I understand is an issue of concern for many countries, of course, because this disrupts supply chains, this derails trade, this complicates bank transactions, this makes the international economic cooperation very difficult and uncomfortable. And this is also a very significant result or implication, as I see, in medium and long term perspective of Russian invasion, because even in case in some time in the near future we will have a ceasefire in place in Ukraine, for me it is hard to imagine that sanctions that were imposed against Russia will be lifted that easy. And especially given the fact that they are more and more, the longer the war continues, the more they become politicized, you know, and the positions of different countries polarized. And of course, it is bad for international economy and for foreign trade. And finally, another very important thing that happened that I see had a very profound impact on world markets is that wheat and sunflower exports were badly damaged by Russia's invasion. Our two countries, Russia and Ukraine, are among top world exporters of wheat and sunflower oil. It's a resource, it's the resources which are vital for dozens of countries, that's basically a life-saving product with regard to food security. For example, such countries as Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, Algeria, which are one of major clients of Ukraine and Russia wheat export. They import from 50% to more than 80% of their wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. And of course, it is good for countries like Egypt, for example, which has already had strategic reserves prepared beforehand of wheat for 3 or 4 months in case supply chains are broken. But of course, it is a potential catastrophe for countries like, for example, cash-strapped Lebanon, who don't have the storage capacities and they can't change the suppliers quickly, especially after what happened in Beirut in August 2020, where their port was blown. So Ukraine's major and one important point here is that Ukraine, why is this so difficult? Why is this really something that we should talk about? Ukraine's major wheat producing fields are located in 6 regions in Ukraine's south, east, northeast, and central and center. Of these 6 regions, 4 are already affected by the war, and 2 are partially occupied by Russian forces. So for Ukraine, the region, and the world, this is potentially damaging, as a substantial amount of our exports of agricultural products, of wheat and sunflower oil, are under constant danger, and this in turn have a profound impact, negative impact potentially for many countries who rely on these imports particularly in their food security policies. Secondly, now the second dimension which I wanted to talk about is the political dimension. So what political implications we can talk as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine? I think that first of all, by invading Ukraine, in my opinion, Russia effectively limited its own foreign policy agenda. For the last 15 years, Russian foreign policy has been aimed at positioning Moscow as an alternative center of power in this, let's call it, the great power competition of the 21st century. And this was the rationale behind their policies in Georgia in 2008 as a response to the so-called Arab Spring in 2010-11, in Syria in 2015, and eventually in Ukraine when they invaded Ukraine first time in 2014, when they occupied Crimean Peninsula and parts of eastern regions, where the main epicenter of military hostilities is now. And with this kind of war, with which they launched on 24th February, where the stakes are so high when we are talking, for example, about serious risks of NATO-Russia military escalation. In my opinion, Moscow limited its own goals and created the situation where they have a very narrow corridor of maneuver in their own policy, because being under such sanctions and waging a total war by its nature really impedes Russian foreign policy goals, which were formulated since mid-2000s. Secondly, Russia's war will alter European security architecture, and I think in two ways. First of all, it will further consolidate European countries. This already happened, both at NATO coordination level and at the level of strengthening European institutions inside European Union, and also pushing some countries for rearming themselves, like Poland has already been doing for several years. And we also heard from Germany that they're going to pour security and defense budget. And secondly, with Ukraine remaining at the middle between Russia, Turkey, the European Union, the United States, further stabilization of the situation will, and maybe possibly deterrence of Russia, which will require deeper interregional cooperation. And I think this will lead, in long-term perspective, this will lead to expanding of the European security architecture, which was formed in 80s, 90s, into a broader Eurasian architecture, when many other countries, regional players from not only from Europe, will have to play a more prominent role in stabilizing regional and international system. Third, which also very important, I think, that Russian war ended the 30-year era during which Moscow was trying to some kind lead post-Soviet integration efforts after the fall of the USSR. I need to elaborate on that. I think after what Russia, for many years, Russia had this really key advantage when it comes to relations with other post-Soviet republics. They could appeal to common history, culture, language in their foreign policy. And this was understandable with many countries, because we all used to be in one Soviet Union, and in 90s, for example, when the memories were still fresh, and this really gave a great opportunity for Russians and an advantage in pursuing their interest with other post-Soviet republics. Now, after what happened in Ukraine, I think that there will be less and less space for this kind of values-driven relationship between Russia and other post-Soviet republics. Of course, economic ties, political and security cooperation will remain in place, I think, but this war damaged this nostalgic related, culturally close relations, which for so many years kept Russia at the pinnacle of integration efforts.
Dr. Iliya, I am very sorry for the interruption, but could you please wind up in next 2 minutes, because we are running short of time.
I'm already finishing.
My apologies for the interruption.
No, it's okay. Okay. So I think this is fundamentally changing the whole post-Soviet geopolitical space, because this depriving Russia of its main advantage, in relations with other countries. And finally, in my opinion, Russian military offensive against Ukraine has become an important milestone in pushing us closer to what seems to become, I think, a multipolar world, in which there will be a number of regional countries gaining prominence and playing a more active role in the world affairs. Because we already see that, for example, such countries as Israel, Turkey, or Poland are the most active in facilitating Ukraine-Russia negotiations, in playing a role in this war, and were even named potential security guarantors for Ukraine in future. So I think that for now we only can see some immediate term such immediate-term conclusions. I think it's really difficult to tell what profound impact it will have, in long-term perspective. But I think the future of Ukraine will be, it still depends on what is going on inside Ukraine with the military situation, because as you understand, it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. We don't know how it will end. Even yesterday's remarks after Istanbul peace talks, they are only now they're still on the level of an idea of a neutral Ukraine, a bridge between West and East with foreign guarantors, with foreign guarantees. But I think it's still an idea, because for now on, the situation is still in the military dimension. And I think we will need, some more time to jump to some really profound conclusions on the future of Ukraine and the whole region. But this is my thoughts on, at least